Welcome to this episode of the Safety and Risk Success podcast with me, Christian Harris. My guest today is Julie Barratt, who's the president of the CIEH. And Julie and I have a great chat about her work as a barrister, some of the themes that she's seen over the years, some of the ups and downs and the challenges and the reasons why defendants sometimes don't succeed in defending. Or prosecutors sometimes don't succeed in prosecuting, particularly with a bias on larger cases that involve local authority prosecutions of health and safety breaches. We also talk about the upcoming CIEH Health and Safety Conference, which is happening on the 17th of March. It's an online event, and myself and others are speaking at that. There's a packed schedule, so I'd really encourage you to come along on the 17th of March. Framing that discussion about the event, we talk about the crucial role of environmental health. What is it? Why is it important? And we take the government to task a bit about the lack in England of a chief environmental health officer. So it's a great conversation full of lots of interesting insights from Julie and her career, spanning legal questions around health and safety, environmental health, and the upcoming conference as well. Hope you enjoy it. See you on the other side of the credits, and do come along and join us on the 17th of March for the CIEH Health and Safety Conference. Cheers.
Welcome to the Safety and Risk Success podcast with Christian Harris. We believe that proactive safety and risk management powers business performance. Each week we explore this theme, sharing guests, stories, insights, trends, hints and tips. You can find us on all the major podcasting platforms, and video versions are available on YouTube. But for now, let's join the conversation with Christian.
Thanks for joining me today, Julie. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Glad to be here.
Good stuff. Yeah, we've got some interesting things to talk about today. I thought I'd start because you've obviously had a very interesting career in the law. I mean, how does it feel to be a barrister acting on behalf of a client and kind of have that weight of responsibility of the outcome of the judgment in your hands to some extent?
Well, it's not true that I have them in my hands, really. All I can do is work with what they give me.
Yeah.
So sometimes it can be extremely frustrating, particularly if I'm prosecuting for a local authority and I look at the case and think, you could have done this, you could have done that, and you haven't. And our life would be so much easier if you had. But equally, if I'm defending a case, I can look at what the defendant, my client, has done and think, if you've done this better, if you'd recorded it better, if you've got an evidence trail that said you've done something, I can sell this story so much better. I'm actually not doing anything in the practical sense. What I'm doing is selling what someone else has done. And knowing what I know about health and safety, both as an enforcer and indeed as representing clients when I'm defence counsel, I can see where things could have been done, should have been done better.
Yeah.
I can see where things haven't been done at all. And I can also see post-event justification, the scramble to cover up what's not been done, should have been done, and has been realised should have been done.
Yeah.
And that can be very difficult. And you think, what, if you'd got in touch with someone earlier, it wouldn't look like this. I wouldn't be having to say this. You probably wouldn't be here. And that can be quite frustrating. But on the other hand, that you can only work with what you've got.
And from your own personal perspective, I guess, having done this now for some time, you've got sort of a lot of confidence around having those difficult conversations and explaining those things to the clients and so on. Is that something that came naturally, or did you feel as if you had that from the beginning?
I think when I started out in environmental health, I probably didn't have it. It's something you learn. You learn how to carefully tell people, actually, you've got this completely wrong. You have completely misled yourself, or you're fooling yourself, and you might believe this, but nobody else is going to. And you do learn how to do it. And it does come in helpful. You can't brutally tell your client, you're dead in the water, mate, get over it. You do have to be quite gentle with them. And equally, when you're talking to local authority clients who, for whatever reason, haven't been able to do things the way you would like them to have done, carry out investigations, find out things that you would have liked, which would have helped. You have to recognise that there are limits to what people can do, and be quite careful about how you share that thought with them.
Yeah, and I liked you used the expression sales or selling. I can't remember exactly what you said, but you know, you're selling the story, and I think that's a great point to make, because it's a skill that people in environmental health and safety, I think, come into the profession and don't realize necessarily that they need, which is that kind of soft skill ability to influence, cajole, sell, as you say. Is that something that you would support, and have you seen any clients that have been particularly good or not so good at that?
I think you're right. I think it's much easier to lead someone where you've persuaded them they want to go than to force them to go there. We know that. And the one thing you can say about enforcement is ultimately you can make someone do it, but they're not going to like you for it, and they're not going to believe what you've told them. But if you can persuade them that this is the right thing to do for all sorts of reasons, whether it's because they want all their staff to go home safe at night, or because it will increase productivity, or because it will reduce the risk, whatever it happens to be, if you can make them buy into that concept or encourage them to buy into that concept, it's not so much enforcement. It's education. And there's a lot to be said for that. Just people who learn a lesson because they choose to are much better at remembering it than people who are compelled to do something and forget about it immediately.
Yeah, there's certainly something in that. And having two young sons, 8 and 5, I can certainly say with a great deal of experience that telling them to do something is much more difficult to get them to do it than if you can convince them to do it.
It's easier, I suppose, as an enforcer, because you do have ultimately the big stick behind your back. You can prosecute somebody, but you also have to remember you've then got to sell the story to a magistrate or a jury, and they've got to buy in as well. And if the jury think you've behaved excessively, if they have sympathy for the person who you are enforcing against because they feel that that person has been treated badly, that will reflect in their thinking. So it's a good, encouraging someone to do something is a skill to have, and it works across all the levels.
Yeah, I think that I've spoken with many environmental health officers who work for councils, particularly those that do primary authority partnership schemes. And a big thing that they always talk about is, you know, working with businesses, not just having that big stick, and actually trying to support them and grow and partner up with them to alleviate these problems and prevent things from happening before they do, rather than just kind of coming in at the end and, as you say, throwing the book at them and taking them to court. And is that a trend that you've seen develop over your career? Is that more common now than it was perhaps when you started out?
I think it is more common, and I think it's more common because the nature of law has changed. When I started out back in the 80s, the law was very much strict liability offences. You either did it or you didn't, and if you didn't, you were prosecuted, and that's the end of the deal. But we have seen concepts creeping into law like reasonableness, best practicable means, due diligence. So it's more about working with people to make sure they are doing things as well as they can, to the best of their abilities. They are using everything they can, particularly in the case of safety. You know, it's not enough just to get over the line. We'd like you to be over the line and well beyond it. And the nature of law has changed that facilitates that happening. So it's not so easy to say, look, you've just crossed the line and that's the end of it, and I'm not discussing it. You do have to get involved in discussion. You can make suggestions about improvements. And if you work with people, you're more likely to achieve a result than if you just tell them to do it.
And of course, there were the legislative changes in 2016 as well, weren't there, around the sentencing guidelines? Has that sort of accelerated that because of the sort of size and scope of fines having increased?
I think it's brought into sharp focus for businesses the risk that they run. When you point out to them just how seismic a fine could actually be, that the court could just close the business down. That's one of the things the sentencing guidelines say to the judge. Don't be afraid to close down businesses. You can see how that would focus attention, and particularly for those people who are repeat offenders. because repeat offending has very serious consequences. And I think it's important that that should be the case. The sort of things we're talking about are so important that you shouldn't be able to say, well, we'll just build into our business model a couple of fines and live with it. That is not risk assessment in any meaningful sense of that word. It's about avoiding going to court, and avoiding going to court by doing the right thing.
It's something that the large businesses, thinking in my space of slips, trips and falls, you know, they seem to, from an outsider perspective, almost accept that there's a bit of a cost of doing business around those types of incidents. And of course, they are taking steps to mitigate risk, but whether they're going, as you said, far beyond the line is open to interpretation. But there have been some big fines in that space. So I suspect that people's you know, opinions on that would have changed as a result of 2016, and people are being a bit more proactive now.
Yeah, one would hope so. In respect to things like slips, trips and falls, which people tend to just, you know, someone slipped and hurt themselves, well, fine, it's only a small thing. No, it's not. It can have an enormous impact on individuals. And the thing I think with health and safety is it's not just about the business being fined, it's about the individual who might have life-limiting, life-changing consequences as a result of something happening.
Yeah.
And that has to be properly reflected. And if we can stop it happening, that's what health and safety is about. It's not about catching and prosecuting people. It's about not getting into that space, which seems counterintuitive for a lawyer to say, but that is what it's about. It's about not needing to go to court.
Yeah, no, exactly. Prevention is always better than claim, is the saying, isn't it? So thinking back about cases that you've been involved in then, are there any kind of themes or commonalities that, I think you touched on a couple earlier perhaps, that you could identify, you know, where the audience should be thinking, okay, these are the perhaps three or four things that I need to go away and have a look at in my business and my organization, and check that we're doing as well as we could be in these areas. You know, any particular areas where defendants fall down, for example, excuse the pun, and don't, you know, succeed in defending themselves.
Yeah, I think I'll probably go to my grave with the words "write it down" tattooed across my head. I constantly say, not just to defendants, but also to prosecutors, it's no good telling me you've done it. You have to prove to me that you've done it. And you have to prove to me that you did it when you said that you did it. There has to be an evidence trail. So if you say 2 years ago, we reviewed our policy, I need to see that 2 years ago you reviewed your policy. And the fact that you did and you remember it isn't going to help me prove it. I would quite like a document dated that says that. Now, I know people say we haven't got time to write everything down and it's all about paper. Well, it is all about paper. And if you want me to tell the jury that you did this 2 years ago, it's very much easier to convince them that you did if you've got a piece of paper that says so, rather than you just standing in the dark and going, yeah, I'm sure we did. I remember it well. And the other point that I made was about post-event justification. It's always obvious. And if I'm prosecuting, I will look for post-event justification. You can always see it because people's stories change in the light of what subsequently happened. And they will always integrate into their narrative details that they couldn't possibly have known at the time. Now, you don't need to do that if you've written it down.
Yeah.
And, you know, I say it to prosecutors, if you've done something, if you thought something, if you've made a decision, you can justify it, write it down. It doesn't matter if you change your mind later. We can see why you've changed your mind, what caused you to change your mind. But if you don't, all we've got is what you say.
Yeah, there's no crime against changing your mind.
None at all. None at all, as long as you do it for a sensible reason, or you just do it for a reason. As long as we know what the reason was, that's fine. But just random mind changing is difficult to explain.
Yes, yes, it is. Yeah, and you mentioned that you do both sides, defending and prosecuting. Is that something that you took the decision to do, you know, because you felt there'd be a benefit to working on both sides? Because as I understand it, some barristers will specialise more on defending, for example, or prosecuting. No,
it's the cab rank rule. You take what comes in.
Right. Okay.
And if the potential defendant gets to me first, if you like, I accept the brief and I defend it. If the prosecutor gets to me first, I accept the brief and I prosecute it.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter. As a barrister, it's helpful to have an insight, and that's what I do have. And that's the thing that local authorities are aware of, that I know what they do and I understand what they do. It's also the thing that defendants are aware of. And they are expecting me to be able to crawl in some detail over what the local authority have done and criticise it. So there's benefits to either side having me. And from my point of view, it makes no difference. I am there to represent my client, and that's the end of it.
Is I mean, if you watch some of these, my wife's a lawyer, by the way. She's a corporate lawyer, so slightly different, obviously. Although some people often will think that, I think this is driven by TV, and this is where my question's coming from. If you're a lawyer, that means you can help me with a divorce, or you can help me with with probate, or you can help me with whatever. And obviously that isn't the case. But quite often, if you're watching these TV shows about sort of legal dramas and so on, they find themselves, in this situation where they're defending somebody and they know that actually they did it. And does that ever kind of happen, or do you? I mean, you obviously still have to act in a professional sense, even if you feel as if the person, perhaps, or company did do what they're charged with doing. But your job is just to try to mitigate that as best as possible, I suppose.
If I had £1 for every time everyone had asked me that question, I would be a very wealthy woman. Bottom line is, I can't represent someone who tells me that they're guilty. If they come to me and say, yeah, we did it, but we want you to say X, Y, and Z, no.
Right.
But you have to go back to the basis of law. The law requires that the prosecutor proves everything beyond reasonable doubt. Now, before my client tells me anything, I will look at the file and I will see if the prosecutor, we're talking about me as defence counsel, obviously, I look at the file and I see if the prosecutor has proved everything, which is basic stuff. The elements of the offence, do they have enough evidence to prove every element of the offence? And do they have enough evidence to prove every element of the offence beyond reasonable doubt? Now, if they don't, I don't need my client to tell me anything. Whether he's guilty or not, I'm not interested, because the prosecutor has failed and we can make a case on that basis. If I look at the file and think, we're going to have certain difficulties with this, I will point them out to my client. The jury are going to have great trouble believing this, or have a look at the CCTV. How would you interpret this if you were a member of the jury? And try and persuade them that what they're proposing to say probably hasn't really got legs. But if they insist that they're not guilty, then that's the basis on which we proceed. If they want their day in court, they're entitled to have it. The words I think I fear most are, it's a matter of principle, because it might very well be, but that's not going to help you. But if someone tells me they're guilty, I just can't represent them. And if during the trial they tell me that they're guilty, I would have to tell the judge that I am now professionally compromised and have to withdraw.
These are all American TV shows that do this, aren't they? So it's probably a bit like the Wild West over there, so it's probably a bit different.
I'm not entirely sure how it works in the States, but I watch the TV like everyone else, and I'm duly amused by it.
Yes, exactly. My wife stopped watching any legal shows at all, because she just says they're all just so ridiculous that she just can't get into them. And I've got a good friend who works in hedge funds, and there's this show called what's it called? I've forgotten the name of it now. There's a big show about hedge funds and this American drama. He said, "Yeah, I can't watch that because it's just too preposterous for me."
Yeah, I have a friend who's a doctor who shouts at the television and is banned from watching medical shows, and I'm pretty much the same. Nobody's done a TV show about slips, trips, and falls yet, so I'm okay. I can just watch whenever I like and just Maybe
enjoy
that's
it.
a market for you, a niche. Get in there.
I'm not sure what the viewing figures would be, but we'll see. Bring it forward as an idea, and I'll start pitching it. But I'm not sure how popular that will be. Although it's a very important topic as well. So your sort of day job now then is helping local authority clients predominantly, isn't it, around your training services?
we offer a training. I have a training business, and we offer training in enforcement skills, litigation skills. So putting together witness statements, treating evidence properly, preparing cases for court, how to be a good advocate. The sort of skills that you don't really learn in university, and you don't really learn at a local authority. It tends to be, here's a file that we did 2 years ago, have a look at that. And what we want to do is make sure people are getting it right. And it is important. One of the things that the sentencing guidelines has done is it's caused defence lawyers to be much more meticulous in looking at what local authorities have done. Crawling over local authority cases and looking for reasons to have the case either thrown out by the judge or persuading the prosecution that they shouldn't proceed.
Oh, from the perspective that, it's the pot calling the kettle black because you as the local authority are trying to tell us off for doing X, whereas you've done X here in the past. That's
right. And criminal procedure is written in law, and you follow it. And if you don't, if you have evidence which is inadmissible, you can't bring it to court. And if you've made a mistake in your witness statement, you're going to have to deal with it in court. And local authorities are risk averse, and you can see why. If you look at picking up the costs of a Crown Court case which has gone wrong, you can see why people are risk averse. So defence lawyers, particularly defence lawyers representing companies that have been prosecuted in the past and are looking at the cumulative effect of the sentencing guidelines, are very keen to keep cases out of court. Yeah. And so they are showing much greater interest in the process of disclosure and the litigation process that local authorities have gone through. And they are helped at the moment, you have to say it brutally, but the fact that people are working from home. Yeah. It is much easier just to take an exhibit home and store it under the bed and then find that it's inadmissible, or to get papers mixed up, lost, contaminated. There are all sorts of meetings going on in forums like this, which are disclosable. Yeah. And as the way we work has changed, so the process around putting a case together has got to change. And unfortunately, we don't move very quickly in local authorities when we're dealing with stuff like this. And making the best of it won't do. It has to be right. Yeah, yeah. My impression, in terms of, a local authority prosecuting a business for a health and safety breach, is that they wouldn't get that day in court from the prosecuting perspective unless they were incredibly confident of being successful. Or am I a bit misguided in that? No, I think you're right. I think local authorities are risk averse. They don't want to go to court and lose. I mean, nobody wants to go to court and lose. I mean, no one sets out with that in mind. But local authorities are spending public money prosecuting. And an awful lot will take the view, well, better to educate than enforce. And it is expensive, particularly if you get the likes of me involved. It's expensive. It's very time consuming. It takes a long time to get a case to court. Yeah. Lots of things can change in the intervening period, and local authorities don't have a taste for it. No. Yeah, it's there's been 2 or 3 big cases that I've been slightly involved in my area, and yeah, it does seem to be a very long process, and I never understood what the costs would be, other than I kind of assumed that the costs were pretty high, because I know that barristers are not cheap to hire. On a day rate, shall we say? So yeah, I'm not going to comment on that. No, no, it's not cheap to get involved in litigation, particularly if you've got expert witnesses involved, and it becomes very time consuming. And if you're a small local authority with limited resources, it can take all your time and all your budget for a result that's not guaranteed. Whatever you do, there are always the things that will trip you up when you get to court. Yeah. And I suppose there's also that balance of, is this the best use of public funds, our time and our effort and our focus versus, other activities we could be doing within the department, that could be preventative or whatever as well. Yeah, that's right. And whilst I would always say that if someone's committed an offence which has serious consequences, you should prosecute it, I can quite see why some local authorities don't want to do that. Yeah. Yeah. It's it makes sense. It's funny as well, because you kind of have this impression of local authorities not thinking too commercially, but that would be a good example where
actually they are thinking with quite a commercial mindset.
Yeah. And as long as in every circumstance they do the same thing, they are consistent and transparent about what they're doing, the decision is theirs to make. But the problem with this is that all too often cases are cherry picked, and it's the easy ones, the people who fall over and plead guilty, who are prosecuted, and the difficult ones are not.
Yeah, and it's arguably the ones that are difficult that you should be prosecuting, because they're the ones that are not holding their hands up and taking responsibility. And
well, that's right. And the difficult ones, particularly the difficult ones that have been prosecuted before and can see the effect of the sentencing guidelines on another conviction, and have considerable concern that they shouldn't be prosecuted, and will put a lot of resources into stopping that happening. I can recall doing some training at a local authority, and they said, we were talking about the sentencing guidelines and the effect they were having on food cases. Actually, they were talking about a health and safety case of a company that had previously been prosecuted, who rang them up and said, look, our lawyers are coming down to look at your files. We want a room where they'll be left in peace. We're going to be there for 3 days. So down come 2 barristers and a junior and a legal executive, and spent 3 days in a hotel in the city looking over the papers, and then decided to plead guilty. Fine. So you spared the cost of a trial, which is good. But they spent a huge amount of money looking for an out, basically looking at the way the local authority had done the prosecution and looking for an out. And had they found one, it would have been money extremely well spent. Probably from their point of view, avoiding a trial was money well spent. A guilty plea with the benefits of the 30% discount is useful. But when businesses are prepared to throw that sort of money at not going to court, you can see the effect that the sentencing guidelines are having. Now, whether they were meant to have that effect, I think, is a moot point. I think they weren't. I think they were meant to put health and safety in the forefront of companies' minds, rather than spending a shed load of money investigating a prosecution to see if it had any merit in it. I don't think that was ever the reasoning, but it's certainly one of the consequences.
And in terms of pleading guilty, probably the most high profile case I can think of was the Alton Towers Smiler incident, and that ended up in court, didn't it? But I think they'd pled guilty to that. So how come that still ended up in court? Was that around the quantum of the fine, basically, that was being decided, rather than anything else?
When you look at the sentencing guidelines, there's a whole lot of things you can argue about: the size of the company, the culpability, all those sort of things. And even if you've pleaded guilty and you've banked your 30% discount for a guilty plea, there is still a lot of merit in arguing about, we are not as culpable as the prosecution say we are, the risk is not as great as the prosecution says it, we're not even as big a company as the prosecution says we are, because all those things get factored into the equation. So even a guilty plea means, yes, you don't have to prove the case anymore, but you certainly need to be in a position to talk about culpability, about risk, about impact, all of those things. And if you think that some company was extremely culpable, and the company are going, no, we weren't, you've still got to be in a position to make that argument and to justify it. So in the past, we've tended to go guilty plea, great, nothing to worry about. And that's not the case with the sentencing guidelines. You've still got to make the case for how the sentence should be imposed, or those things that the judge should accept as fact.
That makes sense. Good stuff. Well, I'd like to just turn to environmental health and CIEH a little bit, if that's okay, and then wrap it up by talking about the conference that's coming up. So you're the president of CIEH. Do you want to just give a quick overview of kind of perhaps even starting at first principles, what is environmental health, if anybody's not clear exactly what it is, why it's important, and then how the CIEH kind of supports that?
Well, what I would always say about environmental health is, if you eat food, if you breathe air, if you drink water, if you go out and you come home safely, whether it's from someone else's premises or to work, and you live in a house which is safe, an environmental health officer's probably had something to do with that. We're in everywhere, doing everything. And my mother always used to say they should do something about it. And the odds on they were usually environmental health. We're involved in everything, preventing communicable disease, making sure food is safe, and all the rest of it, all the things that matter to people, all the things that keep them safe and healthy, we're involved in it. It's very hard to say it's X, Y, and Z. It's not. We're involved in the fringes of some of the stuff, and we're central and middle to some of the stuff that I've talked about. But be that as it may, that's what environmental health is about. The CIEH is the professional body that represents environmental health practitioners, whether they're in local government, whether they're in the NHS, the military, the third sector, the private sector. We bring them all together under a professional body umbrella. And we lobby government, and we work with environmental health practitioners to improve things like guidance, whether it's statutory, whether it's best practice. And we provide training opportunities to make sure people who are, say, working in food are up to date in food, or people who are working in food know what's going on in health and safety. Such is the breadth of environmental health. It's important that you have an organisation that can make sure its members know what's going on and their voice is being heard in all the places that their voice needs to be heard.
Yeah. And from my perspective, COVID and the pandemic was a bit of a watershed moment from the perspective of safety and risk being propelled to the forefront of everyone's minds. We were all making these dynamic risk assessments. Personally, we were all listening to risk assessments and giving our judgments on the risk assessments being made by the various governments and so on and so forth. Have you seen an increase in the depth or breadth of impact that the industry or the profession has had since then? Do you feel as if it's got a greater profile now, and is that something that you expect to continue?
I think we have a greater profile. We're not on TV all day, every day. Not that sort of profile, but certainly the contribution that environmental health was recognised in the places it needs to be. We're in discussions now with CMO England about various things, dampness in houses being one and air pollution being another. Now, you would expect that. We just had a couple of coroner's reports blaming air pollution and mould in houses for causing the death of children. But the wide range of skills that environmental health practitioners have is more recognised, I think, post-pandemic. Because if you look at who was doing stuff, there were a lot of environmental health officers really leading the charge. And that was recognised where it needs to be recognised. The Welsh Government, for instance, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care in Welsh Government said on the floor of the Senedd that environmental health officers were the most important members of his team. Now, we need to hear that sort of thing being said. All too often, if environmental health is working, it's invisible. Yeah. And that's a problem. Whilst it's good, we don't want people to see us prosecuting people willy-nilly. That suggests that there's been a failure somewhere. It's good that we're invisible. It's also bad that we're invisible, because the good that we do can't be seen.
Yeah, that's always the challenge about doing preventative work, isn't it? Because it's hard to quantify or prove something that hasn't happened, that's been prevented from happening.
It always makes me smile when I go to a site and they've got a sign up that says, how long is it since they had a bad accident? Well, I'd like to know what your definition of bad accident is. And that only tells us how long it is since you've had one of those. The rest of the stuff, the not so bad accidents, the mental health and well-being, where's that on your chart? And that might actually be more important.
Yeah, there's a big debate around that, isn't there? Because people would say that on the one hand, it's good to track and it's good to have a KPI and so on, and then on the other hand, as you say, what's that hiding? Because does that introduce underreporting, and how are you defining things? And are you sort of
skewing of focus for sure?
Yeah, you're sort of putting the wool over yours and other people's eyes, and will that come to bite you at some point in the future as well? I mean, for me, I often say that now is the best time ever to be working in this field of safety and risk, because I think you can make the biggest impact, you can have the greatest influence, and so therefore it's an exciting time to work in this space.
I think it is an exciting time to be in this space, and I think it's also a changing time, because the way people are working has changed. It's one thing to go on site and look at how people are working in a building, but an awful lot of people are working from home in conditions we would never accept as being acceptable if they were in a business park somewhere. And how do you get involved in that? Who's going to say your chair's not suitable, the light's not suitable, that you're working absurd hours because you're at home? And what's the isolation? What's the impact of isolation having on people's mental health being? We're not getting involved in that at all. But I think you're right. I only have to look at the number of jobs in environmental health news at the moment. I think there's never been a better time to be an EHO. The only problem, I think, is we're not getting people through fast enough to fill these jobs.
Is that something that CIEH is working on in terms of trying to encourage people into the industry and get more people involved? Yeah,
oddly enough, I was at a careers fair on Wednesday talking to students about why they should take up environmental health. A lot of them don't recognise it as a job. As I say, we are invisible, and so you have to make yourself visible to make people want to do it. And if you speak to an awful lot of people in the profession, they'll say they didn't know about it, they found it by accident, or else they had a relative who was involved in it. It's unusual for someone who's got no link to environmental health to set out to be an environmental health officer. We are seeing a lot of people moving across from things like catering, chefs who see environmental health officers and think, do you know what, I'd quite like to do that. But I think there's a job to be done persuading young people that as a career choice, environmental health is for them. And it is. It's got everything, we can ask them what they want. They want a job that's different. They don't want to be stuck in an office all day. They want to be helping people. They want to be making a difference. And you can say to them, you can do all that. All that in environmental health. And it's an important message. And we are focusing on getting it out there.
Those few things you mentioned there were certainly on my list of topics. So I was in kind of the city before I got involved in this world, and I sort of did a list of 10 things I wanted to get out of my career, and a lot of those were on there, and that is kind of helped me to get to where I am in this world of safety. So I certainly fully buy into that. Is there a case to have we've got a chief medical officer? Should we have a chief environmental health officer as part of the,
Absolutely should. And it's one of the things we've been calling for. We have a chief environmental health and public health officer in Wales. We've got a chief environmental health officer in Northern Ireland. There is a chief scientific officer in Scotland who fulfills the same role. The glaring absence is one in England.
Right.
And I think that absence was shown up in stark relief during COVID. That some of the ministers quite clearly didn't know that they'd got a workforce in local government who were doing all this work. The fact that we got involved in track and trace in England, they set up a system in England, which didn't happen in Wales because we had that network. We didn't need to do it. That has shown it in sharp relief, and it's one of the things we've been calling for. And it's one of the things we'll be talking to the chief medical officer about, is this need for someone who has the knowledge that runs right across all the government departments. And I think that's what's made it difficult in the past, is that no one department can claim ownership of a chief environmental health officer. Whether it's the business department, whether it's housing department or health department, nobody can say that person sits with us, because that person sits across everybody. And with with climate change particularly, there's a huge role that a chief environmental health officer could be playing in government. And it's, as I say, it's one of the things we've been calling for, is Westminster government to adopt a chief EHO post.
Yeah, makes good sense to me. But there's a lot that we won't get into politics too much, but there's a lot that governments do that doesn't make sense to me. So
we'd all do it better given the chance.
Yeah, exactly. We'll leave that one for another day. Well, thank you very much, Julie. Before we wrap up and plug the upcoming CIEH Health and Safety Conference, I just wanted to give you the opportunity to throw out any plugs. So where could people connect with you? Where could they buy your books? Where could they learn about your courses? Have you got any events or anything else you wanted to talk about? So the floor is yours to.
Well, As president of CIEH, I would encourage people to get in touch. I've got a Twitter feed, it's at CIEH President. You can direct message me from there. My email address is president@cieh.org, and I will always reply to people. I don't respond to avatars, I have to say. My face, my email address is out there. I'm not responding to people who hide behind an avatar. But anybody, any member, any non-member who wants to talk to me, I would encourage them to do it. You know, I'm there to speak to people. I'm happy to do that. And I'm happy for people to invite me to speak to groups of people. That's also part of my role. And I'm happy to do that. With my other hat on, my email address is jblegaltraining@gmail.com, and that's where you can get in touch with me about training, and that's where you can get in touch with me to buy the 2 books, Enforcement Notices, Practical Guidance for Local Authority Officers, and Investigation and Prosecution, Practical Guidance, competitively priced at £10 and £12 respectively. They're there if people want them.
Good stuff. Thank you for that. So so we've got the CIEH Health and Safety Conference coming up on the 17th of March. I'm going to be speaking in a session about fall prevention in the workplace, along with Sarah Jane Brown and Caroline Organer of AXA Insurance. Jonathan Hayes is going to be, who's been on the podcast before, he's going to be presiding. And there's another raft of other topics. We've got Louise Hosking, who's also been on the podcast, talking about how to implement the HC 10-year strategy. We've got Louise Mansfield of Bevan Britain talking about the sentencing guidelines. We've touched on some of that today. Andy Lucas is going to be talking about managing fatal accident investigations. So a really full-packed programme on Friday the 17th of March. So I'd certainly encourage people to come along to that, and I'm sure you would too, Julie.
Oh yeah, I think it's a packed programme, and it's got something for pretty much everybody actually. And I would encourage people to come along. It's a great opportunity to get CPD if you're looking for CPD, but it's also a great opportunity just to keep yourself up to date, whether it's hearing something you've heard before and just reminding yourself, or it's hearing something new and thinking that's something I can look into further. It's a great opportunity, and as you say, I'd encourage people to attend.
Good stuff. Well, what we'll do, we'll put the link to the event details into the show notes of this podcast episode, so you can find the information there. Friday the 17th of March, so a couple of weeks' time from when we're recording this. And yeah, look forward to seeing as many of you there as possible. So thanks, Julie. Really enjoyed our chat. Hopefully people have got a lot out of it and got some good anecdotes and had some fun along the way, as well as talking about an interesting and important topic. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Safety and Risk Success podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please hit follow and do share on social media. Does anyone you know spring to mind as a great guest, even yourself? If so, please contact us on podcast@slipsafety.co.uk. See you next week for another episode.